Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the fourth module in our webinar series on facilitating large-scale change. Hello, my name is Ian Smith. I am Programme Lead for Improvement Methodology in NHS England's Sustainable Improvement Team. I am acting as MC and host today for this webinar, and we'll be working with other colleagues from the Sustainable Improvement Team, including Elaine Bayliss and Michael Anderson, who you can see there on the screen. They'll be working with me to monitor the chat box and supporting some of the interactive sections of the webinar. And behind the scenes, we have again Rachel Gray, who will be looking after all things technical. So please do get in touch with Rachel via the chat box on the bottom left-hand side of the screen if you need any help or support. And today we are joined by our good colleague Kathleen Pereira, from Head of Transformation at NHS England's Horizons Group. Excuse me. Catherine is a barrister by background and has practiced both public and employment law for several years before moving to establish an award-winning community organising social enterprise. And also as a Fulbright scholar, Catherine has worked with Marshall Ganz on public narrative and community organising at Harvard University, and she now works with us in NHS England developing social movement theory for our Horizons Group. Catherine is going to lead us through today's session, and she will be introducing concepts of mobilising and organising for large-scale change, and that will include some very practical tips on how we can better engage with others through these stories. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Catherine to get things underway.
Thanks very much, Ian. That's great. And hello, everybody.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Ian, and with everybody else who's on the call, and thank you for the invitation. I will be presenting today, but I prefer to think of myself as leading a conversation. So what I'm going to do is to shape a particular way of thinking about mobilising and organising for large-scale change. And it's rooted, as Ian says, in my experience of community organising. So that's the lens that I'll be using, and I think it's important to put that up front. There are many different ways of thinking about how we mobilise and organise, and this comes from that particular tradition. Now, I say I want to lead a conversation. That's because we have the chat box, as you know. I'll also be pausing rather than waiting to the end to take your questions. I'm going to pause regularly. And I'll invite you at those times to use the hands up function, which is in the bottom right of the list of participants, in order to indicate if you want to be unmuted and make a contribution. So what I'll be talking about are mainly the concepts, and towards the end, very practical tips for how we improve mobilising and organising for large-scale change. And what I would like our conversation space to do is to be a chance for you to share some stories, to share some insights and reflections, or to ask questions of me or others, so that we can make sure the learning is as specific as possible. So what I want to start by doing is getting a post test in the room for how confident you feel to mobilise or organise for change with others. So what I'd like you to do, on the top left of your screen, you'll have an arrow icon. And when you click on that, you can choose where you think you sit. I guess I'm probably about here. Pick up your arrow and then you can plant it where you think you are in terms of how confident you feel to mobilise or organise for change with others. Oh, we're getting a fair old spread. Yeah, lots of people going for the safe middle ground, right? This is good, though. I want to see the people who've put themselves further ahead than me, because I might hand the session over to them in a second. That's great. It's a fair old spread, what I'd expect, most people being in the middle. So feeling conversant, perhaps having used some of the techniques, but a fair few people here with little experience, skills or confidence to do it. And we'll talk about both skills and confidence and their role in building our capacity to mobilise and organise with others. So thank you for that. What I'd like to start by doing before we dive into mobilising and organising is to present some provocations for thinking about how mobilising and organising affects us and the challenges and opportunities that it presents. So this is really a space to do some creative thinking with you around some observations that I have for how this operates both within the NHS and more widely. The first one is this. What I've seen in more and more of the work that I've done recently, where I've been looking with people at how do we create what's broadly called movements? How do we energize and catalyze people to want to make a change? I've seen that people say, you know, more and more I have a hard job just keeping track of who I'm in touch with, what the systems are for that, how I make connections. There's a dizzying array of options. And it seems to me that we have more connections than ever before, yet many of us feel less connected. Recently, I've been chairing the roundtables in Parliament for the Jo Cox Commission into Loneliness. So that was founded by Jo before she was murdered last year. And it's designed to look at loneliness as a wide health issue, and more widely simply than the NHS, and to look at how we build meaningful, deeper and sustained connections with other people. And what I'd like to suggest throughout today's session is that the way that we do that is rooted in relationships, but it's become more and more difficult to build meaningful relationships as the amount of noise in our lives has increased, and the complexity of the interactions and relationships that we need to have professionally has also changed. I think these are massive challenges, and unless we think about mobilizing and organizing in this context, we're going down a cul-de-sac in terms of our capacity to make large-scale change effectively. The second provocation I want to put to you is this. We have a real challenge, not just in the NHS, but more widely, around permission. So often when I'm doing work with teams, coachings and workshops, we talk about permission, and that people see a lack of permission as a barrier for them taking any action at all. I think when we're looking at mobilizing, it's helpful to think of this in two ways. What is the issue? Is it permission from an external source, whether it's a line manager, somebody you want to work with, a fear of getting no? Or is it about how we feel internally? In other words, can we pause and reflect on whether we already have all the permissions we need in order to start mobilizing, to start organizing, and look at it from that perspective out? It may be that the space that you already need to start that project that you've long had in your mind already exists, and it's simply waiting for you to go ahead and grab it. The third and final one I want to share with you before I pause and go to the chat room is this. It comes from a political campaigning background. It was developed by two guys, Jeremy Hyman. Getting some noise on the line. I don't know if somebody's been unmuted. It comes from two gentlemen, Jeremy Hymans and Henry Timms, who founded a number of political organisations, consultancies such as Get Up and Avaz and Move On, that have been revolutionising the way we think about citizen activism. And they've written a book which is going to be published next year around this idea of new power. So what they say is basically this. There are two forms of power in the world at a basic level. There's power that derives from position and authority, that tends to be structured and hierarchical, held by few people, pushed down. In other words, it's controlled through decisions that filter down through a structure. So it relies on command and control. It tends to operate in closed ways, and it tends to be based on transactions. I ask, you do, you ask, someone else does, and so on. And what they said is this is in tension more explicitly in the last 10 years with new power. New power is like a current, an energy, rather than a currency, something I have and something I give to you. In other words, it's an infinite resource. It's made by many, and it often operates on platform bases. In other words, it's transparent, it's open, it's designed to be shared. And for me, this is the key point. New power is based in relationship. So the idea is that we build our relationship first, and through that, we identify the issues that we want to mobilize or organize on, rather than it being about transaction. Now, I don't think Jeremy and Henry, with this frame, were indicating that new power is somehow on the rise and would eclipse old power. What they were trying to explore was that these two ways of being, if you like, are operating in the world simultaneously. new power is perhaps more explicit than it used to be. But what we need to do as people who want to make change is get better at navigating that red squiggly line in the middle, the sweet spot, where we can translate and negotiate and operate in two different worlds, in two different ways of thinking about power. And you'll be unsurprised to know that in terms of mobilizing and organizing, my suggestion would be that we need to operate with both these systems, with both these mindsets. But primarily, we're concerned with new power. How do we bring people in, inspire them, catalyze a change, and build relationships which allow us to sustain a change over a long period of time? So I'm going to pause there, having introduced those three ideas, and Ian, Rachel, come across to the chat box and see what people are saying.
Okay. Well, we've had a comment rather than a question from Barbara, who, in response to one of your provocations, suggested it's easier to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission is a good mindset that can help to overcome waiting for permission or mandate. Don't know if you want to say anything about that, and would you like to invite people to make comments or questions as well?
Yeah, so if I give, thank you, and I'll give a reply to that, and then people please pop your hands up if you want to make a comment directly. Barbara, that is NHS Horizon's team motto, that we ask for forgiveness rather than permission. I would add to it in order to enhance it by saying that we, again, looking at the old power structure, we try to be model corporate citizens. So in order to have the space to ask for forgiveness rather than permission, we make sure that we are following process, that we are the first to put in our returns, and that we create space through compliance. And in a way, Barbara, that kind of highlights what I'm saying here about new power and old power being in a healthy tension, rather than one being more appropriate or more dominant than the other in a general sense. So Ian, do we have some people with their hands up?
I'm just scanning down the attendee list now. I can't currently see any hands. Oh, I can. I can see a couple of hands popping up.
Lovely.
Which, one of which I have just lost because I've scrolled too far down the list. While I look for that one again, there is a comment that's popped in from Darren. Darren Cooper is talking about issue with forgiveness over permission is that sometimes you need confidence to make change. They're coming in there. And sometimes it can be much harder when things don't work out. And I think the next comment that's come through has also come from someone who's put their hand out. This is just my luck. Tocqueville, I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly, has a comment about permission is often enforced in the NHS. Would you like to be unmuted, Tocqueville, to put your question or comment to Catherine directly? And can we do that, Rachel, is the better question. Yes, please. Brave soul. Excellent. Well done. So I'm going to ask Rachel, can we do that unmuting? I think we have. Go for it, my friend.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi there. Sorry, I had to unmute my phone. Sorry. I'm just really thinking about this, Catherine, and I'm thinking my experience in the NHS hasn't been that long. It's been about 5 years. And it's been primarily as a change manager. So change and influencing has always been my everyday thing. However, I feel if you go ahead and you start to do something, you make a change initiative, you go ahead, you're doing something that's actually quite successful. The numbers are there, they back you up, the objectives there, you are gaining, you're getting quick wins, you're getting longer term goals, you're reaching longer term goals. You have your inability to have asked for that permission in the first place is seen as an inability to do your job. You're seen as though you're too much of a maverick, you're too straightforward, and you're not working within the realm. So how do I tackle that? Because that's often my problem.
I didn't get that bit, sorry, about your inability. I couldn't catch up the audio on that.
Sorry, I said so often when you do go ahead with this scheme that you are spearheading, it's seen as more of an inability to do your job and a bigger hindrance than actually the gains that you are gaining from doing what you are doing. So how do you tackle that?
Can you give us an example of that so that we make sure we've understood it? So you would be seen as unable to do your job if?
You'd be seen as, I suppose, for lack of a better word, you'd be seen as insubordinate. Because you've gone ahead and done what you've done, although it may be successful. So how do you ride the balance between the two?
Yes. I mean, I think it's very, so this isn't an answer, but it's a way of thinking about it. It's very context specific. So if we go back to the slide that we have up on old power and new power, how we navigate between those two is context specific. So if I go into A&E, I don't particularly want it to be run like a social movement. I want to have a decision and a direction and know where I'm going. If I'm looking at a complex issue, which is about involving people more widely, I might want to use new power as a way of making that happen. I think partly this is about something I'll come on to talk about around self-interest. So Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a wonderful political thinker, he always said that the key to politics, small p, is self-interest properly understood. And what he meant by that was understanding what motivates us to act, not just ourselves, but others, and taking account of that in our starting point. So self-interest is not selfishness, but it is having a very developed understanding of what drives people, what they want, how what they want is different from what they say they want. And a lot of that comes through relationship and stories and building up a deeper understanding both of ourselves and others. So we think about an example where we might be trying to drive a change, but there's a risk that we would be seen as subordinate. A new power, old power way of looking at the world would say, okay, I need to look at the new power. I need to think creatively about the people I can draw into this, not the usual suspects, but people who can mobilize and inspire others. And those are unlikely simply to be people in the hierarchy. But I also have to have one eye on that old power element, the hierarchy, the structure. How do I present what I'm doing within their self-interest so that it becomes less something which is conflicting for them and more something which aligns with what they wanted to do anyway? Because very few of us have a narrative about ourselves that we are bad people. Most of us have a narrative about ourselves which is about having a purpose or a sense of what the world should be or what the world could be. And part of the way of disarming some of that resistance to changes we want to make is understanding those narratives in other people and working with them so that they feel at all levels, including people who are more senior in the hierarchy, they feel that they're invested in shaping that change with us rather than seeing it as something that opposes what they're trying to do. So that's not a complete answer to the question, but I think it's in terms of a mindset, it might be a starting point to reflect on when we're looking at where we're meeting resistance in change programs. Thank you for the comment. Are there any other comments or observations or insights at this point?
Yes, indeed. There are many comments and observations coming through now. Probably more than I can keep up with. But I think Tocqueville is onto something that there are people agreeing, thinking that that those with a more innovative or perhaps maverick attitude are still not welcomed within the NHS. There are comments about the approach to promotion into more senior roles being more about time served and maintaining the status quo, for example, old power, rather than as an example, Google was given, which is more akin to taking mavericks with creative ideas regardless of career history. So some good comments there as well. And there are some suggestions that the NHS is maybe too much of a slave to process and not as focused on either outcome or innovation as it could be. And I can see there are more comments coming through the chat box that I haven't yet picked up as well.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can. Sorry, go on, Ian.
See if you can. Yes, I was thinking maybe see if you can address some of these as you move on, and I will try to pick up some more comments for later on in the session.
So I'm going to see if I can piggyback off some of that into what we're going to look at next. I'm going to pick up that first point about being seen as a troublemaker or an obstruction when we're trying to make change. And here's one way of thinking about the difference between being a lone wolf, if you like, somebody who makes a change or advocates for a change but doesn't bring others with them, and somebody who is able to mobilize or organize with others. So it's just one kind of model for thinking about it. essentially says that in a mobilizing sense, so when we're looking to build collective purpose with others, there is a huge difference between being a rebel, which is what I mean when I talk about forgiveness rather than permission, and what I mean when I talk about understanding wider self-interest, and being a troublemaker. So troublemaker is somebody who is me-focused, who has an anger that may be unchanneled, who may be pessimistic, who may, in experiences with other people, they may experience that person as zapping of energy rather than generating of energy. As distinct from a rebel or a radical or somebody who can navigate the tension between new and old power, to refer to the previous frame, who is creating rather than complaining, who is focused on a particular mission but is working to draw others into that, who is an optimist who generates energy, and crucially, I think, in the last part, who is looking and whose mindset and way of thinking about change is always about how we create it together rather than singly. So they're kind of two different ways of thinking. And it may be helpful to reflect either for ourselves or for change projects that we see that aren't going right or aren't generating energy. How far do we think this is applicable, if we're honest? How far do we think the primary focus, the mindset, is on doing something with others in order to drive energy, rather than on the issue itself in order to try to make that specific change? Another way of looking at it is, what sort of change is it we're looking to build? Is it simply change on an issue, or is it change in people's skills, confidence and ability to work with other people to make an impact? I've just got some noise coming in on the line. I'm not sure if that's a panelist. That's come off. So when we can build energy with other people by better understanding our own motivations and power, I think that's when the magic happens by which we can change the world. So when I teach mobilizing and organizing, I always invite people to start by thinking about me. Okay? Often when we're thinking about change that we want to happen, and particularly when we're in a mindset of thinking about mobilizing, our immediate focus is, who are my people? What do we want to do? How do I get them to change? I think my challenge back would be, in order to know who our people are, we have to know what we're about, who we are in the world and what it is we're trying to do. And that requires us to ask some pretty fundamental questions. But through that, the magic can come by which we can recruit and mobilize. I want to introduce a small piece of magic now. This is my magic uncle, my godfather, Uncle Michael. Uncle Michael was an eye surgeon. He was a very gifted clinician, a quiet, complex man. He never married, he never had any children, and I think my brothers and I were the closest that he had to true family. As somebody who lived on his own for most of his life, Michael guarded his privacy. He was fiercely independent. I mean, I remember him sitting me down as a child and saying to me, Catherine, don't ever depend on anyone. Look after yourself. Make sure that you can do what you need to do. Don't depend on anyone else for a single thing. When he was diagnosed with cancer, I think what Michael found hardest was the speed with which he came to depend on other people. It didn't fit easily with him, and many times he would descend into black moods. And because he was a clinician, and a very gifted one at that, I think he knew what was happening to him before we did, and before he was even told by the people who were caring for him. Michael's biggest fear in the last few months of his life was that he would end up in the nursing home down the road in Belfast, where he had cared for his mother 20 years earlier. He remembered it as a cold, uninviting place that felt cruel, and the thought of ending up there filled him with complete dread, and we used to talk a lot about that. Yet that was where he went when it became clear that his cancer was terminal, and 1 week before he passed away. Except between then and the time that he cared for his mother, something extraordinary had happened. The nursing home had become a hospice, and I remember so clearly Michael phoning me from that hospice the morning that he arrived, and With complete joy in his voice, he said, "Catherine, this place is paradise. Catherine, they have strawberry milkshakes." And I just remember thinking, you know, a strawberry milkshake sums up all the dignity and respect that we want. And the change that had happened between his mother's experience and Michael's time in the hospice before he died was very simple, but very hard one. It was about a movement of ordinary people, the hospice movement, redefining what it meant to care. And I tell you that story because I think that learning to build movements for change is no trivial business. It's a serious business. It's the difference between somebody going somewhere to die and somebody going somewhere where they can live their last few days with dignity and with joy. So what I want us to try and hold in our minds today is how we create strawberry milkshakes. Okay, because that's what organising and mobilising is about at its heart. It's about creating a sense of joy and energy so that people are not compelled to join in an old power sense, but people want to join in because they feel there is a space where they can contribute, if you like, to a bigger purpose. And it is that knowledge of how to combine with other people, of how to inspire them to want to act with us, that's really at the heart of mobilising. So de Tocqueville said that knowledge of how to combine is the mother of all other forms of knowledge. And when we think about change, on the progress of that, on the progress of our ability to combine with others and inspire them, depends the progress of everything else that we go on to do. So I want to make explicit one point here. I said that I'm giving you a lens of thinking about mobilising and organising. And by extension, it is a lens for thinking about leadership. Okay? It says that leadership is not something that is held by a few people, but it is a practice. And it's rooted in 3 questions. I'm going to share those questions with you and then pause for some further thoughts. There are 3 questions which were posed so beautifully 2,000 years ago that I'm not going to replace what was said then. So the first time we know these 3 questions to have been written down within the work of Rabbi Hillel, who was operating in Jerusalem in the 1st century AD. And he was asked, "Rabbi, how do I know how to be in the world? How do I know how to act?" And he responded with 3 questions of his own. He said this: first, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Second, if I am for myself alone, what am I? And third, if not now, when? Okay? If I am not for myself, if I am for myself alone, and if not now, when? And I think these 3 questions invite us to think about what it means to lead and have purpose in the world, and provide also quite a useful structure for thinking about how we campaign, how we mobilise, how we organise. So the first question I take to mean this: if I am going to ask other people to come with me through uncertainty, through, as we've said on this call, a situation where I may be vulnerable, where I may face rebuke or challenge, then I better be pretty clear about why I want to do what I'm asking them to do and what it means to me. And I better be pretty clear that I can explain that to other people in a way that makes sense to them. So Rabbi Hillel's first challenge to us is to start with ourselves, to think about our narrative, our lived experience, the people who have touched us, what we have gone through, what we have been challenged by, that communicates to other people a deeper sense of why we care about the change we want to make. His second question: if I am for myself alone, what am I? And I think this is because to be a who and not a what is to recognize that we exist in relationship with other people, and our ability to achieve our goals is inextricably linked with other people's ability to achieve theirs. So when we're thinking about how we mobilize, we need to think not just about what do I want to change and why, but how do I work with others to create a space where we can share an understanding. We will probably never have a common purpose in the sense of our purpose being exactly the same, but we can create a space where we share a sense of purpose. So when I told you about my Uncle Michael, it wasn't because I think you've all had uncles who've passed away from cancer or been touched by the ability of healthcare professionals to massively improve the quality of care. But it's because within that story are a number of values that I think we may share. Values around hope, values around dignity for those who are living rather than focusing simply on dying. And the story is the means for us to unlock the space where we can find out, as Rabbi Hillel said, what am I? Finally, his third question, if not now, when? This is the question of urgency. But in a context of large-scale change, I think he means this, that change is not floating around in the ether, waiting to happen. In a messy, complicated world, it is waiting for us to pull it down, root it, and make it happen, step by step, failure by failure, piece by piece, day by day. Okay? So in other words, if not now, when is a call to urgency. And it's a call to engender that urgency in other people by helping them understand not just that there's a change that needs to be made, but there is a situation that is intolerable and that we have the power to change now. It is these three elements, self, us, and now, which is at the root of the framing of mobilizing and organizing, both in terms of how we build strategy, how we think about stories, and how we speak with other people. So there's quite a lot of content there, and I'm going to pause for a few moments to see what people are thinking in response. Ian.
Hello, Catherine. Well, people are thinking and responding, and certainly Natalie Murray has posted a comment that she really likes the Rabbi Hillel theory. So there's definitely some positive feedback coming through. I think on the aspects of mobilising and storytelling, certainly we had from Barbara a thank you for sharing such a very personal story. And some interesting points and counterpoints from some of the group around the maverick aspect that you talked about, and how we're expected to use our skills or allowed to. And Tocqueville commented that organisations recruit people into their workforce for their skill set, and ideally they will let us use our skill sets. And then there's a counterpoint comment kind of agreeing with that position, but observing, I think in line with what you're telling us, that we need to bring others along with us when we're using that skill set and coming to a point of understanding of what we're trying to achieve. So I think very thoughtful comments coming through so far. We'll see if you want to respond to any of those, and we'll see what else comes through in the chat box that we can pick up.
Lovely. I mean, I'd be interested if anybody wants to unmute and possibly share a story of this. I'm particularly interested in the challenge around change starting with me, and starting being the key word, but it starts with us and builds out from there, and whether people have stories that they want to share from that. So please do raise your hand if you'd like to make a comment or share an insight.
Or volunteer in the chat box if that is easier. I will scan for hands and see if I can see any.
Hi Ian, it's Elaine here. We've got Kerry Thorns with a hand up. Yes, and she asked a really good question earlier in the chat box. It'd be great if Kerry could come online.
Okay, Kerry, are you up for that?
Yes.
I think we've unmuted you. Let's hear from Kerry. Go for it.
I'm just pondering really the if I'm not for myself and if I'm for myself alone element. We're running quite a large transformational change program, and we've got some really positive, passionate rebels on our side, but because we're trying to push too hard too soon, the resilience of those people that are trying to do the change starts with me is really wanting now. And it feels a little bit like some of the people that we are finding barriers are for themselves and for themselves alone. And we're just struggling with how yes, the change starts with us and we have great ideas and great vision, great engagement with a whole range of people, but because some key leaders are for themselves, we're struggling with our resilience to keep pushing.
Yeah, and from an organising point of view, the maintenance of energy for the long haul is probably the least discussed and researched part of kind of organising theory. I mean, I think there's no magic to this in the theory, because the magic comes in the practice. But I guess the balance between a long haul strategy for how we build this and quick wins, short quick wins that keep building small peaks of energy, is one way of thinking about it. So possibly pausing and having a creative exercise around what can we win now today. This will prove and build the confidence of the people that we're working with. So that's kind of one piece. Another piece is there's an external part of campaigning and mobilizing and organizing that is about the change we want to see in the world. And at the same time, there's that internal part of the change we want to see in ourselves, our confidence to share stories, our confidence to use narrative as a way of moving others, as a way of speaking to injustice, as a way of shifting people's perceptions. So there might be a question of, are there things that we can do between us now that build confidence, grow our energy and sustain us while we try to unblock whatever the resistance is that we're finding along the way? And both those external focus, the external focus and the internal focus, can be used in different ways to kind of keep the energy of the group going and grow their confidence. Just wanted to come back to the questioner and see if that hit the mark.
It did. Thank you, Catherine. I think the element of OD for change teams is often so underrepresented in the kind of business planning phase that it's a very real thing that people need.
Right. Yeah, it's a good point. And in the kind of organising language, that would lead into that internal piece, you know.
Yeah.
Because and I think it links back with this question of permission where we started in some ways, because part of it is saying, what is our theory of power? You know, often we talk about a theory of change, but what is our theory of power? And here I use power as a neutral term, the ability to act. What is our theory about the ability to act that we have? And how do we think about growing that internal capacity and growing our external capacity in order to move us forward? So it's those two pieces and the way that they interrelate, which is so important in organising. It's not simply about a campaign where we achieve a win on an issue. It's also about, am I growing my people? Are they developing? Have they got a better, more developed understanding of their own power, ability to act, as well as achieving the external goal? So I'm going to just lead into the next part of the session, and then we'll take another pause. And please do, again, kind of flag if you want to make some comments. To recap, what I'm talking about has a particular way of thinking about leadership. And I've taken this from Marshall Ganz. And there are some links being posted in the chat box to materials. Marshall operates out of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And if you're interested in some of these ideas, it's well worth looking at the resources and the reading that he has on his site there. He says that leadership is about accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. And I want to just talk briefly about the distinctions between mobilising and organising, because we've been skirting around that for the past kind of 20 minutes or so. So one way of thinking about that is to use the lens that Hari Hahn developed. And she wrote a lot about the Obama campaign and the grassroots activism movements that are building up around the world in the wake of what we learned from Obama 2008. And she draws a distinction between lone wolves, so what we talked about earlier, people operating on their own, who are either unwilling or unable to build a wider coalition. And she distinguishes that from mobilizers. So mobilizers are people who have the ability and capacity to create moments in time where a change might happen. And their primary driver in doing that is to create an action at a set point in time. And that's to be distinguished from organising. Organising is about creating both the moments in time that come through mobilising, so a campaign action or an ask or a meeting with a decision maker, and about putting as much focus on developing your people as you do on winning the issue. So it's about growing the overall capacity of you and your team through the process of action. And capacity and action are kind of inextricably linked. And I find this quite a helpful way of thinking about the distinctions, because the starting questions that you have as a team vary depending on what you're trying to achieve. If you're simply mobilising at a point in time, then your main focus is quick wins, building to a bigger win, and keeping it relatively transactional. If we want to do organising, then we're looking much more at development, skills, confidence, and more nuanced understanding of power, and making those conversations explicit and creating norms between us as a group about how we make those things as important as the end goal we're trying to achieve. It's also important to say that this way of thinking about change has a particular way of thinking about people. And I like this Michael Ging quote because it sums it up. He says that people who have ideas and drive are on every street, every workplace, every school, waiting to be discovered. Someone has to reach them and recognize them. Someone has to ask them to step out, not to be consumers or props or spectators, but to be players in the unfolding drama of public life. And Michael says that someone is what we call a leader or an organizer. So it's a particular mindset of thinking about people and what we're capable of and what we need in order to realize the power that we already have. So just for the final part, before I get into a couple of practical examples, and we'll take another pause in a moment, I want to suggest how this might link to how we think about networking and connections with others. So we looked earlier at how, in a balance between old and new power, the centrality of my position in an informal network can be as important as my position in a formal hierarchy. And indeed, the healthy tension between those two forms of structure or power is where a lot of action can happen in terms of large-scale change. To create small change, we tend to work through cohesive networks. So when we ask, who are my people, we're looking at our immediate circle. But in order to mobilize or organize for change at scale, I would suggest that we need to be more intentional about thinking strategically about wider networks. So there's a large pool of research around bridging networks. That is, how do I bridge into other organizations, groups, communities of people that may seem loosely connected with what I'm trying to achieve, but actually can provide me with a lot of support and can grow our power collectively. In a healthcare context, we might say, how do we work more closely with local authorities, the voluntary sector? How do we think differently about politicians and what they can bring, people who work with them, those with lived experience? How do we bring the media or social media into this in a way which is constructive to the aims that we're trying to achieve? And always thinking about those bridging or weak ties as well as the stronger relationships that we already have. In other words, it's thinking creatively, who are my people? Not just in our role through networks and relationships and social networks, but through virtual communities and through communities of practice and learning groups that we might be loosely connected with. How do I reflect on those and then think about using them more creatively? So I'm going to pause there and I'll go into the final bit before opening for some final questions. Ian, what are we seeing in the chat box?
We're seeing lots in the chat box, Catherine. There's a very good comment just recently come past that I particularly liked. Justine Jones pointed out that she's found people are ready to sign up to a shared vision based on improving outcomes or service user outcomes, but are less willing to make changes which impact on themselves, particularly on themselves personally. And Louise Stewart has agreed with that and summed it up very concisely with change is fine as long as I don't have to change. I think it plays into the comments and suggestions you were making around change starting with ourselves. I wondered if perhaps you might like to comment on either of those points, Catherine.
Yeah, no, I think they're both very, very insightful and very true. There's a saying, isn't there, that if you want things to stay the same, then things have got to change. Which sounds quite flippant, but what I really like about it is that its heart, it suggests, you know, the reality that not just the world is changing, which is a truism, but the experience, I think, of so many of us is that the pace of change is accelerating. Okay, we feel that in all sorts of aspects of our lives, whether it's in relation to automation and artificial intelligence, social networks, the way we communicate. I was reading Carol Dweck, the psychologist, yesterday, who said that if teaching in universities is to keep pace with the acceleration of change, then students will have to accept that they will be preparing to invent careers which they cannot now even conceive in 5 to 10 years' time. And so the idea of planning a career becomes a nonsense. So in this environment of uncertainty, you know, I think one of the things we see, which the comments highlight, is an increase for all of us at an individual level to a tendency towards pushback or to preserving a space that makes sense for us. As the new power element, to use that shorthand, becomes more explicit in the world, then the tensions between new and old power, I think, will become more explicit. And we'll see that tension even more clearly.
Good points. Other good stuff in the chat box. Like me, other people think that flippant is good. I think you've had a question. You might know the answer to this one. Someone has commented, who said be the change you want to be? While you ponder that, somebody has suggested not anyone in an STP. Which they, I thought was a good comment, which they acknowledge is a little flippant, but they are making, I think a good point that that although radical change is required for some of the challenges facing STPs, that their feelings that perhaps mavericks and more innovative folks are not perhaps as involved in that process or as welcome in that process as perhaps they could be. And then there's a good point from Liz that it's not just the fear of change that people are looking at, but the fear of loss. I think because so much of what we're dealing with is so very new, so very different, so very unknown, as you just mentioned, that if we can't see that new future being better than now, it's quite concerning and disconcerting for people. So some good comments there, and some of my inane, if not flippant, thoughts on them as well. For you to do with as you will, Catherine.
It's a beautiful comment about loss, and I think acknowledging that. So it leads quite well into the last thing I want to talk about for a few moments, which is stories as an emotional resource. Mahatma Gandhi was the person who said to be the change that you want to see in the world, and I promise I haven't just Googled that. It's one of the few pieces of information I'm confident I know. I want to talk about stories because I'm becoming more and more aggressively assertive in promoting the use of stories and advocating for the use of stories as really the only means by which we can both build relationships and create the emotional space that allows us to move with others towards action. So if I show it like this, why stories matter? Because so much of our time can properly be focused on what we do, the analysis, the strategy. Yet unless we understand why we do it, we will fail to move people. And if you think about it, the root of the word motion is emotion, is movement. You know, we talk about films or stories that moved us. So in a literal sense, if we want to make change that, as Liz say, moves from loss to hope, we have to understand what it is that moves people, what it is that would make us receptive to making a change. And stories are at the very heart of that. So I would like to see a rebalancing in the way that we think about evidence, in the way that we think about large-scale change as well, towards a more qualitative element as well as the importance of quantitative data. Jonathan Harris put it in a more blunt fashion than me. He said, I think people have begun to forget how powerful human stories are, exchanging their sense of empathy for a fetishistic fascination with data, networks, patterns, total information. Really, the data is just part of the story. The human stuff is the main stuff, and the data should enrich it. I hope and expect that I am not saying that as new information to anybody. But what I am saying is that we all have a responsibility in leading this way of making change to assertively make the case for this way of thinking about data. That if we want to mobilize others, data is contextual to making that happen, but it won't create the movement in and of itself. And I want to end by just sharing one example of how this whole piece around mobilizing and movement might fit together. So I'm not going to talk about NPJ paralysis just because of time. I want to share with you the smallest things. It was it was initially a conversation started by an extraordinary young woman called Catriona Ogilvie, who was an occupational therapist. And she had two children, two sons, who were born prematurely. And in both cases, she had a difficult and quite traumatic experience of being in hospital for many months. And she started talking with me, some other friends, about wanting to improve the experience of mums and dads of premature babies. And she said, you know, I'm so bored of being asked by health visitors, why is Jack failing to thrive? And me having to explain, well, he's severely premature and that's the reason. She said, I'd love it if there was just some way of indicating that he was premature so we didn't have to go through those questions. And so she went into the hospital where her son had been born, started a conversation, and they agreed to start producing the stickers that you can see in the top right, the little silver stickers with a star that go on the front of all the maternity red books. And they did a small trial of a few dozen using these. And the stickers merely indicate that this is a baby that was born prematurely. And it's designed to both give a mum or a dad the space to have that conversation with a health visitor and hopefully signal to the health visitor so that they ask appropriate questions. And they trialled this. It then expanded to several thousand. There are now many trusts involved. And from that, many people, mums in particular, started contacting Kat and asking her to share more about her experiences in local media and on the radio. So she drove from her story, her lived experience, towards what became a campaign that has achieved many things, including a debate on the floor of Parliament about maternity rights for mothers of premature babies. It's created an organisation, which is now a campaigning organisation, and a charity that's aligned to it. But the point is, don't please be intimidated by the scale of what Kat has achieved, because it started simply with an idea that she took into action, knowing that she was likely to fail, not knowing what the end result would be, but opening up and having that conversation from a place of really understanding what it was she wanted to change and why. So I asked Kat, how would she explain that to us in terms of tips that we could take away that are practical? And she said this, just keep it simple. A simple ask linked to a simple story so people know why you're doing it and what you want to change. Know the facts and how to use them. So that's data is the rich stuff that provides the basis, the context for the story. And think about this question of self-interest and power. You know, have a theory of power and ability to act. Who influences whom? How do I think more creatively about my people? So just to finish, we've got a few minutes left. I want to say this, please don't, if you have an idea, wait for the perfect moment to do it. That confidence, in my view, is built through action and through failing, yes, and through learning from that failing. But if we wait, we're never going to achieve our goals. I love this because it basically says, you know, we have a vision in our head of what we want to achieve in driving change, which is perfect. But our reality is more likely to look like a really ugly hedgehog with bad teeth. And that's okay. Start small, build it up piece by piece. The thing that matters more than anything else, which links to, I think, all the questions that participants have asked today, is about how we sustain it for the long haul and how we build strategies to do that. So I want to leave you with one final thought about commitment. Commitment is staying loyal to what you said you were going to do, long after the mood you said it in has left you. And if you want to know more about any of the topics that we've covered, if you want to be part of probably the largest community of change activists across the NHS, then please think about signing up for the School for Change Agents. For those of you who haven't done it or come across it, it's very simple. It's 5 WebExes that happen in the spring, February to March, on 5 different topics about how we rock the boat but stay in it. But it's so much more in terms of a community. There's usually about 3,000 people, both in the UK and internationally, who sign up. Maybe 500 of us take the course each week. We have Slack groups, Facebook groups. We have a learning platform. We connect via Zoom sessions. We have star guest presenters. It's really a celebration of how we make change happen, and a chance for you to expand your networks in ways that you probably, if you're like me, couldn't have imagined when you first started the first module. So I hope that you'll join me then. And thank you very much for your time today. Back to you, Ian.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. I thought that was excellent, and that many others in the chat box are also agreeing. So that is great. So we've got a minute or two before we bring the session to a close. I don't know that we necessarily have time for questions. I'm going to put one to Catherine before I close out with the last slide. There's a few questions on this theme, but I'm going to paraphrase. I'm going to ask the question: does the NHS need new blood, and will we find it difficult to get that new blood given the culture that we have? What are your thoughts on that, Catherine, very briefly before we close up the session?
Well, I'll probably pull back on my tendency to quote and say that the NHS will continue to deliver, to paraphrase, as long as there are people there to fight for it. I think the way that we get new blood into the NHS is for us to continue to share the stories about why it matters. You know, I was in the States recently presenting at a big conference where they talked about consumers of healthcare and customers of healthcare, and to be able to stand there and say that we are delivering the School for Change Agents as a true NHS product, free at the point of use, for everyone, forever. If we can get that story out there, then there's nobody that we can't mobilise to come into our workforce. So I'm not denying the challenges that we face in terms of culture, in terms of the way we feel, in terms of morale, in terms of the pressures on the system. But what I'm saying is that we can make one little step and do it piece by piece, and this stuff is a good place to start.
Well, there we go. There we go. I think we've ended on a high point there, Catherine, with a very motivating answer to a complicated question. So thank you very, very much. So I think all that remains for us to do, please do continue to thank Catherine in the chat box. I think she's earned it. What's coming next? Next week on Monday this time, slightly out of sync with the Wednesdays that we've usually been working on Monday the 27th of November, 3 o'clock till 4 o'clock, we will be joining some of our other colleagues on another series of webinars looking specifically at the value and impact of networks and networking being a big theme throughout our large-scale change webinar series and a big part of how it works. So we'll be joining with some of the experts on that particular domain from our team. So please do pop that into your diary and join in that session next Monday. The week after, we'll be back on Wednesdays again. If you can't make Monday, please do join us 2 weeks today on the final webinar, which will be looking at how do we measure the impact of some of our large-scale change efforts. And we've got Samantha Riley from NHS Improvement joining us on that. And finally, if you have not yet joined into the collaboration space for our large-scale change community on NHS networks, please do so. I'm hoping that Rachel is ready with a link to pop in the box, and she is, of course. If you could grab that link, go through that. 215 of us who have joined into that space so far. If you've not done it, please do so. It will be the place where you can capture the video recording from today to rewatch any of the session or any of those that have gone previously, and where we've shared lots of links to resources today as well, and we'll make sure that we put all of those into the collaboration space so you can find them all in one place. And slide decks from today will be in there as well. So that's it, folks. I think that brings us to the end of the session. Please do on your way out complete the evaluation form. There are three easy questions to answer around what you thought of the webinar and what you learned. If you want to go a little bit further, there are some knowledge questions if you're interested in receiving some CPD certification for being part of the program. But that said, that is us for today. We hope that we can connect with you again next week and the week after. Thank you very much, folks. We'll see you next time. Have a good day.